All right, guys. Nice to see such a huge crowd. And well, this is a first in a series of I don't know, workshop on lenses. But well, the name lens itself isn't really that precise because what are we going to talk about is our optics, which lenses are only one kind of an optic. And yeah, in today's session, we'll focus exactly on lenses. And just a disclaimer that I'm not that good with lenses, or let's say I don't know how they work under the hood, but well, that doesn't stop me from using them and sort of understand how they work. But you know, I wouldn't re-implement them just from the top of my head. So I guess that's a good news because well, you can just use them without really knowing how exactly they work under the hood. And in this session, we'll focus on exactly that, like the intuition that is good to have when working with optics and not like the exact implementation of them. All right, with that out of the way, what are like optics or lenses? So optics are tools for accessing and updating some data which is held in some other data, and all that is done in a pure functional way. So we won't be mutating original data, but instead we'll produce new objects all the time. And well, that's a really big trend right now in software development and in front end as well. So I think it's a nice property to have, and it eases the reasoning of the software for your programs. This document will be shared is kind of like literate programming document. So I will have like code snippets in here, which were executed to speed up the process, but you can like replay this whole document itself. But like before we dive in any deeper, I needed to define some basic functions that are common in functional programming. So, well, functional programming is all about composition. So I basically defined just that. So I can compose two functions from A to B and the other one from B to C to get new function from A to C. Like everyone knows this stuff. The thing is that this like classical composition is sort of like a right to left. So F function is executed first and then the G function. But in not functional programming languages, people are most often familiar with a so-called pipe function, which kind of reverses the order of composition. And in fact, this is such a useful function that I believe it will soon be added to the JavaScript in form of an operator, right?
Yes, looks like.
Yeah. So I basically defined those functions that we'll use further. All right, but that definition for an optic may be a bit vague, so I thought about like a use case. Oh, sorry for that. So before we start, let's like define some data types that we'll be manipulating in this workshop. So this is basically, you could say that's a simplified Twitter. Like, you know, I have my timeline, which consists of tweets, array of tweets, right? Each tweet has its author, the message that it brings along, and number of likes. And author, I mean, user has few fields, right? So we'll be playing with that, and I prepared some like demi data that will be operated during this workshop. Okay, and now let's say we're given the task, well, to access email address of the author for the third tweet in your timeline? Well, using pure JavaScript, that's pretty straightforward, right? We can execute this, and in like a few seconds, we'll get the result that the author of that tweet is a Niels Erikson. I mean, email of that author is Niels Erikson at Discovery. Okay, that was pretty easy, but what about updating that address? Well, with an update, things get a bit more complicated, right? In order to be immutable, we have to like deconstruct the whole thing, update the email, and then like combine the whole thing all along. But yeah, sure, it works. If I set an email address to some new value and get that new email, I'll get the updated result, right? Well, let's try to refactor a bit what we just done here. And let's start with the getters, because well, we have written like big function that will do what we want, but there are a lot of smaller pieces here that we could like extract and probably reuse in a lot of different places. So what we can get here is basically like smaller accessors that will just get a specified tweet from a timeline, then get author from a tweet and get his email address, right? And using those smaller pieces, we can build up like the same function that we just written above, but using like, but just composing the smaller functions. And sure, that works the same way. Okay, but what about setters? Let's try that approach as well. So we're gonna write a function that will set email address in the user and we'll get updated user. That's pretty straightforward. The same, we can do the same for an author of a tweet. So that's pretty straightforward as well. And update the tweet in timeline. That's a bit more complicated, but it sure looks a little bit better than the previous one, but not that much, but a little bit. So the problem is that those don't really compose that nicely. I mean, sure, we split it, that update function into smaller blocks, smaller chunks. However, before we update anything, we first need to extract our data anyway, right? We need to get the tweet, get the author, and then use those values to update everything and build everything together. Sure, it will work, but it's really not that better. Yeah, but we get updated value. So with that approach, I would like, ask you guys, do you see like any more shortcomings of that approach? I mean, because, well, it's hard for me that I don't see your faces, so I'll ask you for a bit of participation. So
I think there's nothing. Yeah, it all makes sense in terms of compositional, the way you're composing all these different uses of functionality. I think what it's more really about is the ergonomics of using the lenses within the framework, and not necessarily the basic principles of the framework itself. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we'll get to that, but you're asking now what's the downside of the approach you've written so far, and I think it can blow up.
What do you mean by blow up?
Well, is it safe? The way it's working now, it kind of banks on the fact that it will actually return the right thing, and it will never be indexed out of bounds or anything.
I mean,
Say again.
Slices. You know that array slicing?
yeah.
Wouldn't that
Okay.
blow up?
No.
That's true. That's one of the issue. Cool.
But I don't know why we are talking about this.
Oh, hang on. How does it blow up?
I mean, the index can be out of bounds. Yeah, that's true. That doesn't.
Yeah,
really,
but slice just returns an empty array if it's out of bounds.
Is it an array?
I
Yes.
mean, yes, slice returns new item. So yeah, that's true. That's true. If that's
No, what I mean is,
no,
is tweet an array?
I was actually more.
Oh.
Sorry.
I was just saying maybe this is something we can ignore, but tweets might not be an array.
I mean,
It could be another thing. Maybe that's
no,
what Niels
that's
wants.
actually that one is actually guaranteed by TypeScript, right? Because we set its array of tweets, so that's
Okay.
not really the issue. In a slice one, yeah, I mean, the slice would just return like empty, as someone said. I don't know who. What I'm talking. Well, yeah, thanks. So what I'm talking here actually is more about, in the sense of ergonomics and stuff like that, and like future proofing, because well, if we look like the final solution of not really the final solution. We defined two functions, right? One for updating the value and one for accessing the value, right? And we kind of specified the same thing in two places. Because, well, in both of those functions, what we really did, we said, okay, I'm interested in a like second tweet and the author and the email field, and update that or get that in the previous function, right? So we are repeating ourselves, right? Get second tweet, get the author, get the email. We are repeating ourselves, and basically just that. Yeah. So whenever we decide that our data type should change, we have to go in and reflect that change in all of those places. So that's one thing. And the other one is, well, I was kind of like hinting a little bit before, that in order to set something, we first are fetching all this data and then using that to construct new values. So we have like this, traverse this thing once to get, and then traverse again to update it. Would be nice to see nod your head if you follow what I'm saying.
I'm nodding.
Yeah, I'm also nodding. Thumbs up.
So, I mean, that's sort of the issue that was kind of hinting. And, well, yeah, what if we could tackle that? What if we could define some generic data type that would allow us to use that data type to get and set values of type A in some bigger type S. And this is exactly a lens optic.
Can someone mute? There's moving furniture.
So just to reiterate, the lens allow us to take some big data type S and do stuff on portion of that type A. And by stuff, I mean basically get or set, update that value. Hopefully everyone understand that.
Yes, sir.
Again, it would be nice to see some heads. And
Who
not
can
only,
turn on his camera?
and not only that, but set all, I'm sorry, lenses also allows us, well, lenses can be composed. So,
Always.
I'm sorry?
No, never mind. I read. No, never mind.
No, Peter just thinking out loud. Don't worry about it. We'll mute again.
No, it's glad to hear that, someone's following along because, never mind. So again,
Expect everybody to follow along or they will interrupt you. That's probably better.
anyway, again, if we have a lens from like some big type S to some type A, and the lens from that type A to B, those can be composed to get that B directly from S. I mean, pretty much the same way as function composition works, right?
Yes.
Cool. But since we basically hidden our operation of getting and updating behind some abstract data type, we need some like operations that will allow us to do those stuff. And those very basic two operations are called view, which is basically getting an A from bigger type S by using a lens. And the other part is operation called over, which given a function that will manipulate this smaller type A and a lens and this big data type S will give us the updated data type S. And I want you to keep in mind that those aren't the exact definitions that you can find in the prelude, but I think this is the nice intuition to have when thinking about those two operations. All right, so if we kind of grasp that, we can go ahead and try to refactor our whole example a bit by using basically the lens library from our prelude. So given what we just learned, we can write lenses for like the same smaller chunks that I described before. So getting an email from an user, getting an author of a tweet, and getting the second tweet from a timeline, and compose those together to get our final lens. Unfortunately, I couldn't like execute code in this document that was using our library code. So I wrote a little test case that we can execute. So basically the first test says, okay, view. So basically use this lens to get the value that it points to from the timeline, and that should be Niels Erikson. And the second one is basically update the value that the lens focuses on and use the same lens to view that value. Well, we should get updated value, right? And I believe that should pass. Hopefully. Yeah, everything works.
Woo!
So, yeah, that's like the very basic of optics and lenses. And we actually, by writing these tests in this way, we also like touch very briefly that lenses as an like proper, how to say it, mathematical constructs obey some laws that can be leveraged to test those, right? What we basically written here is in a sort of a pseudocode that if we view, if we execute view using a lens over and on the stuff that we just modified, we should get the same data. And because we have that law, we can actually, instead of writing manual tests like this, we could very much generate our test case randomly and execute many tests on the code that we wrote. But yeah, that basically is the lens, which is like the very first optic that people usually learn. And I tried to, I don't know, provide you with some well, benefits of using them, that basically we don't like wastefully write so many like getters and setters, and instead just use lenses to like limit the amount of code that is needed to write, because those can be used for both like updating and getting data. And while this example is pretty simple for the purposes of the workshop, where in Luna, when we have to deal with like sonic response in a JSON API format, I believe then you can see like the real power of lenses, when you can actually like compose a lot of stuff and get the like data that you need and that you want. So I believe that it's pretty good use case for lenses. And the other one that just dropped recently is global state hook. Since basically global state is just that, you need a way to update the state and get that state. So, and you do that by just specifying lenses. So in a single place, you define how to get the exact data that you want. Raj, if
Can
you
I
try
have a
to sum-
tangential question?
I don't quite understand.
It's really hard to hear you, Rajiv.
Yeah.
Can I have a question then?
Sure.
So this prop has two type parameters, type and string, and couldn't the string be inferred from the argument?
Let's find out.
So that's the prop.
I wanted to write explicit types just so we
Okay.
know, but let's figure it out. We can just like delete this one, and we'll see that email is exactly length from user to string. So yeah.
Oh, and you can even, couldn't you even delete the so prop is when it's called, it has
This
email.
one.
Yeah.
This could be problematic, I believe, because
So users need it, but email could be email could be inferred from the parameter. No?
Yeah, I guess it could, but that would require us to change the type of the prop to have some default.
Okay.
Default parameter. Yeah, because it requires two. If you specify those type generic arguments, you need to provide both of them. Yeah.
And have you seen Rajiv's question in the chat as well?
No, not really. I didn't have chat open. Let me see that one.
Yeah.
What happens if the object change shape? Yeah, if the object change shapes. Well, that depends. For example, here, I mean, let's try. If we modified a user, right? Like delete a name. Sorry. So I believe nothing should happen because, well, this only cares that we have an email field, right? And we still get an email. Well, obviously we have errors in the in the dummy data definition, but if we delete an email, right? Well, you can see that we have an error that says, yeah, type email doesn't satisfy constraint, ID name.
But so this only happens when we have the type definition for the data. But what if the shape of the data that we get from the backend, for example, changes, but our type definition is not updated? Is it still safe? The length is still safe to use. So, for example, user.
I mean, no, in that case, we kind of don't. I mean, the length basically, specifies, okay, this one says this user, well, it's a type of user. If we get data that looks different than what we defined, then obviously that's an error, but that's also why we do validate the stuff that we get from the server, right?
Oh, okay. So it's, okay. But then in that case, it's a runtime error.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so,
it can only be runtime because,
I mean, if you expect to get certain stuff and you get different stuff, so that doesn't really, satisfy the constraint for your program. So you should error out with possibly the most meaningful error you can get. And well, right now we kind of do. We kind of grab all the validation errors and we can like report them to Sonic and said, guys, you promised us data in this shape, but you violated that promise.
Yeah, if I can have a word, and Peter, also when you have like, you're dealing with data, you're not sure about the type, then there's also other kind of optics that's called Prism that could work with the types you don't know upfront.
oh, okay.
Yeah, exactly. With non-deterministic data, basically.
Yeah.
It depends on your use case. You can validate before and then use the lenses, or you could use this one. That's just your own decision.
Okay.
All right. So kind of.
Oh, sorry. Just to
Yeah.
follow up on that. You can hear me okay this time?
Yeah, right now.
Yes.
This time.
So based on this first example of when you would use lenses,
Mhm.
we have this nice generic pattern for having getters and setters into the object, and we rely on the type information to check when we're trying to access something that doesn't exist anymore. So you remove name or email.
Mhm.
But in this kind of example, it's not necessarily any more safe than just using dot accessors, right? Because
No, I mean, what I kind of was trying to show here is, okay, yeah, it's more about like ergonomic and again, don't repeating ourselves. So we get both getters and setters in a single strike, let's say,
okay.
and not really like type safety at all, to be honest. Because, well, right now, exactly, TypeScript gives you the same information when you use the dot syntax. What we gain here is, well, basically ability to compose more complicated things from the simple one and do it only once. I mean, by only once, I define that in a single place instead of like multiple. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I follow. That's that makes sense, and particularly when you have complex data structures.
Yeah, exactly.
Keeping your data immutable, it's
Mhm.
very important to have a clean pattern to be able to reach into the object, change something, and then get back
Exactly.
a new version of the object.
Exactly, because if you consider, for example, like your standard Redux application, because hopefully everyone's familiar with that, you kind of have like the same issue because you basically write what they call selectors, basically, which are getters from your store to the data that component is using. But then in order to update your store, you need to write Redux actions and this big ass switch statement, which updates the stuff that you want. And yeah, so.
That's a good use case, I agree.
I mean, yeah, that's basically why in our global state hook, there is like a lens, like I tried to explain previously, because that's basically, it should work both ways, right? We should be able to get and update that data. Yeah, are there any more? And on a question of type safety, there's like one more paragraph in what I prepared. So there's one caveat to what I wrote, what I have shown you guys, and you guys will kind of catch it pretty fast. Because if we look at the very first function that we wrote, this one. So can anyone spot what is wrong with the get email from second tweet?
Yeah, second tweet.
Is it the index is wrong because it's the base? Your index is based off 1, not 0.
So actually, it's the index based off 0, but you're
That's
right.
what-
The index is wrong.
Yeah.
Oh, right. It should be the third. Right. In the description, it's first.
Yeah, that's
No. I mean, but this is. So the name of the function is wrong. Okay.
So it's
Nice
correct.
one.
but
Is this
the-
Nice one.
The function name is wrong, so change it to third. And
Now,
you're
okay. Let me. What about now?
But is this not something? Oh, is this not something that shouldn't even type check? Because the type of tweets,
They should return a maybe, probably, right?
Well,
I mean,
maybe it's.
it type checks in current TypeScript, but it's kind of a bug in TypeScript, right? Because getting an index from an array can always return an undefined. So it should only type check when you specify that the array is 5 or 6 elements
How
long.
can you do that?
So there should probably be a
The
lens.
tuple type.
for
And
arrays.
exactly, the Peter is right. Currently, the TypeScript doesn't like the type returned from array access
Index. Yeah.
don't include undefined. And there is an open issue from 2017, and actually Przemek found even earlier one that, but they kind of don't want to change that behavior. So yeah, I believe that's pretty wrong. So actually, that approach, like I mean, even the standard TypeScript one isn't that safe. And I kind of use the same bug in the lens definition to get like second element. That's yeah, like I kind of abuse the type system in the same way, because what we actually would like to have here is a different kind of optic, not a lens, but something else. But yeah, that will be covered in a future sessions. So that's like all that I have prepared for today. So are there like any more questions?